What if the ache you feel isn't from what you've lost, but from the parts of you that were never truly lived? The voice does not rush. It arrives like fog on a quiet morning. Slow, sacred, undeniable. There's a kind of sorrow that doesn't scream. It hums beneath the surface of our days, waiting, not for answers, but for awakening. And in that stillness, the old man begins. What if, he whispers, as if sharing a secret the world forgot. Your real strength was never about holding on, but about knowing exactly when to let go. The silent season, when life begins to whisper instead of shout. Thomas leans back into his chair. A gentle creak of old wood, and his eyes soften. Let me tell you about Mina, he says. She was a widow he met in northern Thailand many years ago. Her husband had died suddenly. A heart attack while working in the rice fields. One moment he was there, laughing over lunch. The next, gone. Just, gone. That was the first arrow, Thomas explains. Life's unavoidable wound. But Mina didn't stop there. She blamed herself. She replayed every moment of the week before his death. Every silence between them. Every missed gesture of affection. Every ignored symptom. Her grief became soaked in guilt. A heavy, suffocating fog. I should have seen the signs. If only I had insisted he see a doctor. Maybe he'd still be here. That was the second arrow. And in Buddhism, that second arrow is the one we fire at ourselves. The Buddha taught that the first arrow is unavoidable. Death, illness, loss. But the second arrow? That's ours. It's our resistance to what is. Our unwillingness to accept impermanence. Our craving for a version of reality that no longer exists. Pain is what happens. Suffering is what we build on top of it. Thomas closes his eyes for a moment. She couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. The storm wasn't outside. It was inside her. It is not said with judgment. Only tenderness. A kind of shared knowing. Because clinging, too, is part of the path. Until it isn't. And when Mina finally loosened her grip on the guilt, when she allowed herself to grieve without self-punishment, something miraculous happened. She didn't forget her husband. She remembered him more clearly. Not through the lens of blame, but through the grace of presence. And she wept for him. Not from guilt, but from love. This is the great secret of the second arrow. Once we stop resisting, it falls away on its own. And all that remains is healing. Stillness in the storm, grief as a practice ground for peace. Thomas shifts slightly in his chair. Not out of discomfort, but as if honoring the weight of what he's about to share. His voice lowers, softer now. As if the story he carries must be handled with care. Storms don't stop, he says. Just because we ask them to. There's no anger in his tone. No bitterness. Only truth. The kind of truth that takes years to arrive at. And even longer to accept. He tells us about Raymond. A man in his 70s. Who lost his wife after 41 years of marriage. She didn't leave in drama, but in silence. One day there. The next, not. The silence was the loudest part, Thomas says. It filled every room she used to walk through. Raymond tried what most people try. Tasks, distractions. Filling the calendar with anything that might hush the ache. But grief has a way of following you, even into the noise. And so, finally, he stopped. He did something most people fear. He sat. At first, the sitting was unbearable. His knees hurt. His back screamed. But none of that compared to the weight behind his ribs, the hollow ache where love used to echo. Memories didn't whisper. They crashed. The silence turned into sobbing. His breath was shallow, panicked. But still, he returned. Every morning, every evening, he showed up. Not to feel better, not to get over it, but to simply be with it. This is what mindfulness in its rawest form looks like. Not a peaceful spa day, or a retreat on a hill, but the gritty courage to sit beside pain and not look away. It is not about mastering emotion, but about making space for it. A place at the table, a cup of tea for the sorrow. That's when he stopped drowning, Thomas whispers. He learned to float. And that's the shift. He didn't remove the storm. He became the one who could breathe inside it. Buddhist meditation does not promise to end pain. It promises to transform our relationship with it. Stillness, in this path, is not a form of giving up. It is an act of profound bravery. It is the willingness to be present with what hurts, to witness it, to let it soften, not because we force it, but because we've given it permission to exist, without judgment. Over time, Raymond's grief didn't vanish, but it changed. It stopped screaming. It became quieter, like waves that once crashed, now rising and falling, gently. Stillness isn't the absence of pain. It is the space. That Thomas turns his gaze toward the camera. Not commanding, but inviting. Close your eyes, he says. Just one breath. Feel it. That is your anchor. Not your title. Not your achievements. Not your reputation. Your breath. In Anapanasati, the ancient practice of mindful breathing, taught by the Buddha himself, each breath is more than oxygen. It is a message, a doorway, a return. When the mind wanders, to regrets of the past, to fears of the future, the breath is the path home. Always home. You are not your past. You are not your fear. You are here. Now. Alive. Each inhale whispers acceptance. Each exhale releases resistance. Breathing like this isn't complicated, but it is revolutionary. Because for most of our lives, we're not breathing. We're surviving. And survival isn't the same as presence. When we give attention to just one breath, something shifts. The mind pauses. The heart loosens. The moment reveals itself. The Buddha didn't offer this as metaphor. He offered it as liberation. The breath doesn't require belief. It only requires attention. And attention, when repeated gently over time, becomes devotion. And devotion becomes refuge. And refuge, for the tired soul, becomes freedom. Not escape. Not numbness. But freedom. The kind that whispers, I am safe now. I can begin again. Even here. The gentle power of discipline. People think discipline is about being tough, Thomas says with a knowing chuckle, not mocking, but gently unraveling a misconception he once carried tightly in his own chest. He chuckles not because it's funny, but because it's familiar how we all, at some point, confused rigidity with strength, and force with commitment. But real discipline, he says, voice falling into a tender hush. It's tenderness. Repeated. Not pressure. Not punishment. Not barking orders at the self. But a quiet companionship with your own life. A vow you whisper to yourself not once, but every morning you rise. The Rituals of Miss Helen, a love letter to the ordinary. Miss Helen, a retired schoolteacher with silvered hair and a calm that made even birds pause, never made a show of her discipline. She did not journal it. She did not post it. She did not need the world to see. Every morning, not out of duty, but out of devotion, she would rise with the sun. Not to seize the day, but to meet herself in it. She would wash her face with cold water, not to jolt herself awake, but to cleanse what yesterday left behind. She would light a candle not for religion, not for ritual, but as a soft declaration, I am here. Then she would sit in silence, a silence that wasn't empty, but brimming with awareness. Tea in her hand. Steam rising like a prayer. No urgency. No checklist. Only presence. I don't do it for anyone else, she once told Thomas. I do it so I don't forget who I am. That is Sila Buddhist discipline. Not a cage, but a compass. Not a whip, but a whisper. Not a command, but a caress. Discipline as a sacred return. In the modern world, discipline is often tied to exhaustion, to pushing through fatigue, through pain, through everything your soul is begging you to pause for. But Buddhist discipline does not break the spirit. It centers it. It says, come back. Not because you failed, but because you wandered, and wandering is human. Sila offers us a rhythm to live by. A way of walking gently through the forest of our days. Sweeping the floor becomes worship. Folding clothes becomes a lullaby. Drinking water becomes a reunion with aliveness. This is the radical kindness of discipline. It doesn't ask you to be someone else. It asks you to remember who you already are, and to practice that remembrance, slowly, daily, and with reverence. The wind vs. the ground, what carries you when nothing else does? Thomas smiles as he continues, tapping the wooden floor beneath his feet, the kind of smile born from decades of watching motivation come and go. Motivation, he says, raising a single weathered finger, is like the wind. It's thrilling when it's there, gusting through your soul, making you feel invincible. But it's inconsistent. Sometimes it carries you. Other times, it vanishes and leaves you sitting in a silence that feels like failure. But discipline, Thomas says, tapping again. Discipline is the ground. It holds you when the wind dies down. It keeps you upright when the air is still. It doesn't ask you how you feel, it simply says, I am here. Stand on me. This is why monks walk the same path each morning. Why they chant the same lines. Why they bow to the same quiet altar. Not because they crave structure, but because they understand structure allows the spirit to rise without getting lost. Repetition is not boredom. Repetition is devotion. The quiet heroism of showing up. Thomas looks away for a moment, perhaps remembering all the mornings he didn't want to rise, the weight in his chest, the ache in his back, the grief that made opening his eyes feel like too much. Motivation will leave you, he says softly, when it's inconvenient. But discipline will walk beside you. Even when you're tired. Even when you're hollow. Even when no one is watching. That's the secret, he says. The people who seem strong aren't always inspired, they're just faithful. Faithful to a path. Faithful to a breath. Faithful to a life that's worth showing up for, even in its quietest, most unremarkable moments. In the end, peace isn't found in dramatic awakenings or grand transformations. It's cultivated in ordinary acts of sacred consistency, love practiced, again and again, in quiet places no one applauds. That's how you build a mind that doesn't crumble when the world does. That's how you build a heart that remembers who it is even when everything else forgets. Letting go of what weakens the mind. Thomas falls into a thoughtful silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. His voice lowers. Not out of weariness, but as if he's about to share something sacred. Something not meant to be taught, only offered like a candle held out in the dark. You want to know what weakens us, he says, almost like he's asking himself. Then, one by one, he lifts his fingers. Complaining. Chasing comfort. Clinging to failure. He pauses after each one, letting the weight of them linger. They don't arrive with noise, he says. They sneak in like shadows. Soft. Harmless at first. But if we don't notice them, if we don't gently, mindfully call them by name, they begin to eat away at us. Slowly. Quietly. One complaining, the habit of withering gratitude. Complaining doesn't seem dangerous. It even feels reasonable, therapeutic, in a way. But over time, Thomas says, it becomes like dust in the lungs. Invisible. Constant. And deeply damaging. It rewires the mind to seek what's wrong, not what's here. What's missing, not what's enough. The Buddha once said, what we dwell upon, we become. And when we dwell in complaint, we become tethered to dissatisfaction. Every sunset becomes too short. Every kindness not enough. Every moment, a stepping stone towards some imagined better one. Letting go of complaining, Thomas whispers, is not pretending everything is fine. It's choosing to see what is and meet it with awareness instead of resentment. To chasing comfort, the soft trap that numbs the spirit. Then there is the pursuit of comfort, more subtle, more seductive. We think we've earned it, Thomas says. After a hard life. After heartbreak. After surviving so much. We want softness. Ease. And there's nothing wrong with rest. But when comfort becomes the goal, the only goal, it builds a prison, a very gentle one. Padded. Warm. But still a prison. The monks I met in Thailand, he recalls, chose to walk barefoot. Not because they had to. But because discomfort kept their minds awake. Discomfort, in the Buddhist tradition, isn't punishment. It's presence training. It sharpens awareness. It returns you to your breath. It reminds you, you are still growing. Growth lives, Thomas says softly, just beyond the edge of ease. 3. Clinging to failure, the story that chains the heart. Perhaps the most deceptive weight we carry is the story of our own failures. We confuse letting go with giving up, he says. But they're not the same. He shares the story of a retired mechanic from New Mexico. A man whose hands were rough with oil and steel for over 40 years. And yet, after retirement, those same hands reached for something he had never touched, a paintbrush. His first paintings were crooked. The lines unsure. The colors too bold, then too dull. Neighbors laughed. He almost did too, out of shame. But he kept painting. And every time the brush slipped, Thomas smiles. He whispered, I'm still learning. That one sentence became his mantra. Not just for painting but for living. Letting go of failure doesn't mean erasing the past. It means refusing to let it define who we are now. It means meeting ourselves with the same gentleness we would offer a child learning to walk. The candle in the quiet room, what strength really looks like. Thomas picks up a small candle that rests on the table beside him. It's unlit. Simple. Unremarkable. Strength, he says, isn't loud. It doesn't storm into a room. It doesn't prove itself. He lights the wick. The flame flutters, then steadies. It's this, he says. A candle. In a quiet room. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't compete with darkness. It simply glows. Steady. Quiet. Undeniable. And that, Thomas says, is what letting go makes possible. When you release complaint, you reclaim presence. When you surrender comfort, you rediscover aliveness. When you drop the weight of failure, your hands are free to create again. Letting go isn't loss, he whispers. It's lightness. Final whisper, closing reflection. As the light fades and the room grows still, Thomas leans in, voice low, eyes kind. You don't need to prove anything, he says. You're not here to impress the world. You're here to remember who you are. Healing begins not when we fight, but when we finally stop running. and sit beside the silence we've been avoiding all our lives. Maybe real strength, he whispers, isn't about holding on, but knowing when to let go. Final invitation. Sit. Breathe. Be. And if something in this touched your soul, don't let it be the last time. Subscribe to Whisper of Age. Not for more noise, but for the soft voice that reminds you, you are not behind. You are not broken. You are simply coming home.